Great. Well, thanks, everybody. It's fun to be down here. It's for the first time. I moved down to Raleigh a couple years ago and based at the Museum of Natural Sciences just down the street one way, and also at NC State just down the street the other way. So we're kind of forming a triangle here at Shaw University, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about some of the research. And I want to start this story with start this talk with this story about Fred. Fred was one of our volunteers who was running camera traps for us. And this is our eMammal citizen science project that is where we have volunteers running camera traps, basically going out to the woods and doing the fun part, collecting the data. And so Fred was out in South Mountain State Park and was going to pick up his very first camera trap. He put it out a couple weeks before, and he was going to pick it up. And as he was walking down the trail, he was having an experience that maybe some of you guys have had, where he wasn't seeing any animals. He was in the middle of the woods, and he wasn't seeing anything. And he had a buddy along with him at the time, and they were sort of chatting, well, geez, there's nothing out here, and this whole camera trap thing, it must be a waste of time because we're probably not going to get anything. And then when he got his memory card and he brought it back and he plugged it into his computer, and he got this awesome picture of a coyote staring right at his camera trap. So this animal had been out there, and the point is, when you go out in the woods, all the animals run away from you. Usually you're out in the day and they're out at night, and it's really a hard thing to be a mammal watcher. And this is the great thing about camera traps, is they let you, really find out what's out there, and they let you get cool pictures like this. Not all are as beautiful as Fred's coyote, but certainly we get a lot of interesting pictures. And the other great thing that we scientists like about this is that I can verify that this is a coyote, right? If you tell me you saw a coyote, how do I know? Maybe it was a dog, maybe it was a fox, maybe, it's hard to really trust what people say they saw. But with camera traps, we get this voucher photograph, which is very much like a museum specimen. In the Museum of Natural Sciences, we have skins and skeletons of all sorts of different animals, and they all have tags that say where they were collected. And these camera traps are very similar to that. This is one of the most important things really about science, is that things can be verified. And this is what camera traps let us do, is verify occurrences of animals. And so what we're doing really is using camera traps as a verifiable citizen science-based method for surveying mammals. And here you can see some videos that we got when we were working up in New York. And we can really count the animals. We can use these videos to count the turkeys as they walk by the screen, see how many animals were there, and verify what other people observe. And the other good thing about camera traps is we get really good measures of sampling effort. Right? We know when the camera trap was put out, and we know when it was picked up. So we know if it was out for 3 weeks or whatever. Whereas if you're going out for a walk, telling me exactly how many hours you were out or how many miles you hiked, it might be more difficult to quantify. So we've been using this citizen science project all throughout the East Coast, getting pictures of all sorts of big animals and some of the smaller animals too, and really trying to solve some of the great mysteries out there, right? Do bears really do it in the woods? Well, we got this bear taking, go to the bathroom in the woods. Sometimes you get funny pictures. Sometimes you get interesting behaviors. So when we started this project, we were looking at, we picked specific places. This is kind of what I call eMammal 1.0. We had a very careful study design. What that means is we knew exactly where we wanted our cameras to be run, and we picked these sites to answer specific questions. So we had some sites that were hunted and some sites that were not hunted to see what the effect of hunting was on wildlife communities. And then we had within those some sites that were on the hiking trails, near the hiking trails, or far from the hiking trails. And this lets us look at the effect of hikers on wildlife as well. And so we would go to specific parks, 32 parks from South Carolina to Maryland, so a pretty big area. And we would recruit volunteers, and they sampled for us over 2,000 locations. This is, imagine going, if I had to go myself, or even with a couple paid field assistants, and sample 2,000 locations with camera traps, it would be a lot of effort. So these volunteers really put in a substantial amount of effort and really helped us a ton to do a really big survey. And so I'll show you some results from that study, but I also want to mention that we're sort of working on what I call eMammal 2.0, which is more where volunteers get to pick where they want to run the camera traps. So instead of us saying where we want to run them, volunteers run them, and we're looking at questions in this case of urban to wild gradients. So we want to have some run in real urban areas, in suburban areas, out in the rural areas, and then out in the more wild areas to see how much wildlife is moving into our cities, how much wildlife lives right with us, and how that compares with the more in the urban areas to the wild areas. And one of the things, so we started doing this, and one of the things that's part of this is we have moved all our training online. So we have some little videos and some little quizzes to teach people how to run camera traps, whereas in the past we would go and do a 3 or 4 hour in-person training session. And very happy to report that this online training is just as effective as our in-person training. The quality of the data is just as good. So maybe that says we weren't very good trainers in person. But and we're also we're looking to work with a wider variety of volunteers. So we've got some projects specifically targeting middle school groups. We've got some college classes running camera traps. We'd like to work with some hunters who often already have camera traps. And of course, just the amateur naturalist that wants to go out. And we're also interested in maybe trying some international work with eco-tour groups that might be interested in running camera traps. So I always get this question, so instead of waiting for the end for the question, I'll just answer it now. Often people ask, well, don't your cameras get stolen? And basically, almost none of our cameras got stolen. We did have, in 31 of our 32 parks, we had only 2 stolen cameras. They're all locked to the tree, right? So you got to really want it. And one of those we actually got back. There was one park in Tennessee where we had 3 stolen cameras. And we had a few more lost along the urban greenways here in Raleigh. And the interesting thing about the park in Tennessee is we also got this creepy picture. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? The mountains of Tennessee. 2 guys hiding their faces. And look at the one guy's got stuff stuffed in his shirt. We're pretty sure they're ginseng poachers. So ginseng is an endangered plant that people sell. If you dig up the roots, you can sell the root. You might have seen ginseng for sale. Picking ginseng in this state park is illegal, but men are going around, sneaking around. So we think probably these ginseng poachers were seeing our camera traps and stealing some of our camera traps. So this is kind of an overview of some of our results from our park surveys. So 32 parks scattered across 6 states. And here you can see just some of what we can do of saying, well, within these parks, where do animals live? Where do they not live? So you can see the bears are in the mountains, but not in the in the Piedmont area. Coyotes are pretty much in all of these parks, but in some parks more and some parks less. So there's definitely a lot of variation. You can see we've shown that with the sort of size of the circles there. And some of the interesting results too are to just looking at this simple, are they there or not, comes with the question of house cats, domestic cats. So there was a paper last year that estimated that free-ranging cats kill billions of birds and up to 20 billions of mammals every year. So people are worried, wow, these cats are killing all our native wildlife. This is a really big problem. But one of the things they didn't do was ask, well, where does this killing happen? And I would say probably if most of the cats are killing wildlife in their backyard, where they're killing common cardinals or chickadees or species that are, maybe it's still a bad thing, but it's not a real crisis. That's different than if they're going into these nature preserves where we're trying to protect nature and causing trouble there. So we wanted to say, okay, we sampled 32 parks. How many cats did we find? And the answer is very, very few. In almost all of these parks, half of our parks had not a single cat, and 30 out of 32 parks had, well, 1 cat or less. 2 parks had more than 1 cat, basically. Rock Creek Park is a very urban park in Washington, D.C. It's a long, skinny park that's got houses and apartment buildings all the way around it. We ran 75 camera traps in Rock Creek Park for 3 weeks each. This is the only picture of a cat that we got that whole time in Rock Creek Park. Here's a map of our study sites showing you the black ones are ones that we did get at least 1 cat. The white ones are ones we didn't even get a single cat. And then on the top you can see here's Rock Creek Park. You can see all the green space is the green space and the red space is houses. And you can see just 1 cat right there. And probably one of the reasons that we got so few cats in these areas was because of all the coyotes. And so all of these parks, except one, had a decent population of coyotes there. Even Rock Creek Park has coyotes. And this shows you how abundant cats were and coyotes were in different types of habitats. So in the parks, they're over there on the left, we had so few cats, they don't even register on that axis, right? There's a couple there, but they're really, really rare. Whereas in the yards, we had a lot of cats, 300 times more cats in the average backyard than in the average nature park, which is a good thing, that they're not in the nature park, I guess. And very rarely do we get coyotes in backyards in Raleigh. That's just in Raleigh. So you can see where they are overlapping are some of the small urban woodlots and the urban bike trails, the Raleigh greenways, where we would get both of them together. What about dogs? We got many thousands of dog pictures of people walking dogs, mostly. So here you can see a picture of a dog on a leash. Sorry, this says 80% on leash. That's wrong. It's actually 40%. I have to change that. So most dogs are not leashed, but most of the dogs are on the trail. So we had just about 1%, 1.5% of dogs were actually off trail. So there's actually quite a few dogs in parks. Most of them are on trail. And we can sort of put this in comparison with coyotes and see, actually there's more coyotes out there than dogs. If we think about, well, what's the ecological impact of dogs? Well, it's certainly less than coyotes, but maybe on the similar scale to that. And we definitely had some cases of dogs chasing deer on camera. So here's a dog that was taken, a picture of a dog at 11:51. And then a couple minutes later, here comes this deer running by, and then you see the dog still sniffing around. So the dog was actively chasing the deer. Here's another one where you can see the dog. Here comes the deer running by, kind of this blur. And then a couple seconds later, there are these two dogs, kind of just. These dogs look like they're playing around. The other dog looks like a real hunting dog. And we actually, what do we have to compare those dogs to? Well, we had 5 instances of coyotes actively chasing a deer. Here you can see a coyote chasing a deer. I cheated on this picture a little bit. It's actually 2 halves of pictures, 6 seconds apart. So the coyote really was chasing his deer, but he wasn't like a half a second behind. He was actually 6 seconds behind. We get a little video clip, so I animated that. But so it does look like, actually, in terms of the harassing wildlife, dogs are harassing wildlife, chasing deer at about the same rate as the wild predator. So that might actually be something to be concerned about. In terms of looking at questions of how common are different animals, how widely spread are they in different habitats, in these different parks specifically, we looked at what's the housing density, sorry, that shouldn't advance. What's the housing density around a park, and what's the likelihood of detecting that species? And what you can see in this case with coyotes, the more urban parks actually had more coyotes. So the parks that were out in the middle of the country, like Shenandoah National Park or something like that, out in the mountains, very low housing density around that, had some coyotes. But the more urban parks, like Umstead Park or Weymouth Woods, or some of the parks up in the DC area, actually had more likelihood of coyote and also of deer and squirrels. We can also, for some animals, look at real density estimates, and we can start to make some of these comparisons. So in this case, because males had unique branching patterns, we can identify individuals and we can start to count animals in a different way. Sorry, a couple of these are on auto advance. And so what's interesting here is you can see where are there more deer, in the hunted parks or the unhunted parks? The no hunting, right. So deer hunt, if you allow hunting, you're definitely decreasing the deer population. And each of these are paired sites, actually, so it's a pretty strong relationship. The interesting thing is we find actually more coyotes in the hunted area, which is strange. So less deer and more coyotes in areas where they're hunted. We haven't totally figured that one out yet. We can also look at the time that animals are active. So we can do an activity graph and see what time of day they're active. And we found something interesting with coyotes where if you standardize for sunrise and sunset, because we sample different times of year, right? So they're responding to sunrise and sunset. Coyotes have a consistent pattern of having this peak of activity a few hours before sunrise. So early in the morning, they had this peak of activity. And what we were interested in was, well, what about the other species that coyotes interact with, like foxes? Coyotes love to chase and will kill foxes if they can. So foxes should be avoiding coyotes. And what we found was that areas that had low abundance of coyotes, foxes had a very similar activity period. But areas that had high numbers of coyotes, foxes actually avoided that exact period where coyotes are most likely to be around. So we were able to document this avoidance of coyotes by red foxes in this case. Now, one of the key things to being able to manage all these pictures, we've got many millions of pictures that have come in from all these sites now that our volunteers have sampled. And the key to that is to have this a good data management system. What that means is some software, some websites, and some databases to deal with all these pictures. And this is the first part of this. This is our desktop tool, some software that we've created that volunteers use on their own computer, and they identify each picture for us. So they say, this is a deer, this is a raccoon, I don't know what this is a person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they upload the data to us and send it to us, and then we go through and verify everything. And the great thing about this is that at this point now, we're reaching the point where the limitation in the type of science that we can do is becoming not limited by data collection. Because so many people are interested in running these camera traps, we can get so much data that this is really great. This used to be the limiting thing. This is becoming, we're not quite there yet, it's still a bit of a bottleneck, but I can see the future where we're going to have, there's going to be so much data that the problem's going to be more data management and quality control. And how do we verify all these pictures? Because right now, the volunteers upload the pictures for us here, and then we have an expert in my lab down at the museum that looks at every picture and just double checks all the identifications, and then it gets put in the Smithsonian Digital Repository database. So one of the things that we want to do is work on some automated tools, maybe some crowdsourcing of the species ID, or some image analysis algorithms where the computer would also help us double check. So here you can see this little video running at the bottom is some of the work that my collaborator at the University of Missouri has been working on to basically extract the animal from the camera trap video. And once the computer knows where the animal is, it can start to try to learn how to recognize what species it is. So this will help feed into our expert review process so that, you know, if the original volunteer says it's a deer and the computer algorithm thinks it's a deer, then the expert doesn't need to look at it. Whereas if they disagree, then the expert needs to weigh in. So this is some of our future plans of incorporating some of this image analysis into the process. And so the other thing that we'd like to do is create some of these websites where you could see your own results. So if Shaw University's class had a class that ran camera traps, they could have their own portal that summarized their own results, and then the next year they could come back and add to that and have this as something to show off. But at the same time, it would be going into a larger database that other people could use as well. So if NC State kids wanted to compare what the Shaw kids found, we could access each other's data. So we want to make these data available and also make it sort of customizable for you. And what we'd like to do is scale this up and work in a number of different urban to wild gradients. So we have we don't have funding for this just yet, but this is kind of the grand vision, is to see how do the urban animals in Raleigh compare to Charlotte, compare to Chicago, compare to LA, to these different areas. And because what we know is that in all of these cities, predators and other animals are moving into cities more and more. They're changing. There are more predators in Raleigh now than there were 20 years ago. The animals are changing. They're coming into these urban areas. And so we want to look at how that is different across the country and what the impacts of that are for urban ecology to have predators in an area that never had them before. And we'd like to work on some international connections, and we also have a new project funded by the State Department actually to use camera traps to connect kids across cultures. And so we've got now a group of schools in Mexico running camera traps, and we're about to get next month a group in India started as well, and they'll be working directly with some kids in Wake County and comparing what animals they find around their schools. sort of using this as a way to connect across the kids, and then also, hopefully doing some science along the way. Yeah, that's the end of my talk. I guess if you guys have any questions or anything, I'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks a lot.
So not working with camera traps very often, I do have with Dr. Butler, but what is the chance, say like with the cats, that you're just missing them? What's the probability that you're not seeing something with these pictures, or
Sure.
the likelihood? So.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the camera traps work, the ones we use are triggered by moving heat. It's a passive infrared motion sensor, and so it takes an animal walking by that's warm-blooded to trigger it. So snakes and turtles, we don't get pictures of, but also, so cats are going to trigger just as well as, say, raccoons or something like that. One of the things that we found is that there's a relationship where the bigger animals are detected further away. And so we get deer might trigger the camera 15 meters away. And cats might trigger the camera only 8 meters away. And so we have to be careful if we're going to directly compare the cats to the deer like that. But if we want to compare cats at different areas, then we're pretty safe for that. The other thing we do at every site, we characterize the site-specific detection distance. And the way we do that is we just walk back and forth and see how far it will trigger on a person, the maximum distance. And that lets us take into account that, well, maybe some areas have really thick vegetation and it blocks it a little bit more. So we have a record of that for that particular site. We know that. So when we do our statistical models, we can include that site level variation into it.
Okay, and how much area? So I know you said in Rock Creek that you put out 75 traps, so that's pretty well documented. But what about some of these rural sites? How many traps are you putting there?
Well, we did the same protocol for all these parks,
okay.
Which was aiming for 75 cameras total, 25 on the trail, 25 near the trail, and 25 far from the trail. So that ends up being a different density of cameras for the smaller parks and the larger parks. We set a size limit of at least, oh shoot, not remember if it was 5 or 10. It was at least 10 square kilometers. So we were sampling mostly larger parks, okay. And we wanted that because for our experimental design to keep things consistent. So we had some that were much larger than that, and we had some that were just that, but we didn't have any real tiny ones.
What do you have to do to get it at your school?
What do I have to do to do what?
What do you have to do to get it at your school?
To get the cameras at the school? Well, so we have two ways that you can participate. If you're a student in my class, then you have to do it. If you want to volunteer as part of as a volunteer without being a student in my class, we actually have cameras we can loan you. And so that's a good question. I should have mentioned our website. So if you just Google eMammal and Raleigh, you'll come to our website where you can sign up. And what we'll do is you'll have to take a little online training thing before we'll give you a camera. We want to make sure you know what you're doing. And then we'll loan you a camera. And you can come pick it up at the museum, and you can run it, and then you can upload your pictures. And if you want, you can try it in a couple different places, and then give us the camera back when you're done.
What effects do temperature and weather have on predator activity?
Effects of temperature and weather on predator activity. We don't know. No, we haven't done that analysis yet. That's something we want to look at. One of the things I found in New York when I was running some camera traps up there is that the snow level would really affect how much they moved around. And we would find if there was deep snow, they wouldn't be very active. But then if we'd get like a little icy crust on it, and then they could run around on top of the snow, then they'd be everywhere. And so that really affected their locomotion. But we don't really know. This is one of those questions actually that some of the middle school kids are interested in, is looking at the effects of weather, because that's the kind of thing that we don't really know. No one's really done that kind of analysis. So there's a lot of these real basic questions that, honestly, we don't know the answer to this question. So this is something that we definitely can look at, and we haven't started that analysis yet, but we'd like to.
And anything other than, you guys see any predators other than coyotes,
yep.
cats, and dogs?
Yeah, we got a fair amount of bobcats, and it was interesting when we looked at in these different parks where we get our where we get the bobcats and where we get the coyotes. And I showed you how as parks had more and more houses around them, coyotes were actually more abundant, and also deer were also more abundant. Bobcat had the opposite trend. They dropped out completely, very early on. So the bobcats are present in the most wild of the parks, and as you get more houses in the surrounding landscape, the parks lose their bobcats. And the interesting thing about that, like that's maybe not too surprising to us here in the East Coast because we don't see bobcats very often. They're generally thought to be pretty rare. But what's interesting is if you look in California, bobcats are really quite urban. In Los Angeles, in San Diego, in San Francisco, they are right in the urban areas and totally different out here. So this is part of what that's actually the bobcat example is exactly one of the examples that's motivating us to want to try to look more comparatively over a broader area and try to figure out why are these animals behaving different? Why are bobcats so different in the East than they are in the West? And what does that mean for the role of predation in the ecosystem and the effects on the prey species and everything else that feeds into with the ecosystem?
Thank you, appreciate it.
So I hear stories about both bobcats in the farms south of Raleigh, where I did some of my dissertation work, and also occasionally of black bears in places like Garner. I figured you would be the person to know whether or not these are true stories or whether these are people badly misidentifying things like house cats and large dogs.
Yeah, no, good question. And this is exactly why having a photo voucher is so good, right? So you can tell, was it a bobcat or was it a house cat? Well, a photograph, you'd probably be able to tell. So we haven't run that many rural cameras yet. That's actually something we're looking to expand on. What we did in this sort of the second round where we had people running cameras wherever they wanted to, is we said we're going to let the first 100 people run cameras wherever they want, and then we're going to look and see what we have and figure out what we need to do to recruit to get a balanced study design. And what we found is that we need more rural camera traps. So we don't have very many cameras down in Garner, so I can't say specifically there. Bobcats, I wouldn't be surprised. We have had a couple. We had one in a kind of a rural part of Durham, and we actually had our first Raleigh bobcat just a couple weeks ago. The museum has a property called Prairie Ridge. This is kind of on the outskirts of town, and we actually had a bobcat there. And so the interesting thing about that case is we've been running cameras on Prairie Ridge all year. We have 8 cameras that we rotate through, so we always have been monitoring. There has not been a bobcat there until just recently. I don't know actually the date on the camera. It's probably the last month or so. So that was, and it looked kind of like a young bobcat. So it's probably a dispersing animal, looking for a place to set up territory. So that, in that case, animals can show up anywhere, and that's probably the case with the bears, because bears, there are no breeding bears in this area. And there's bears on the coast, and there's bears in the mountains. And historically, we had bears here, but there aren't any now. And what I think is kind of interesting about the bear situation in the middle of North Carolina, is the North Carolina Wildlife Commission is actively trying to stop bears from recovering in this area. They don't want bears in Raleigh. I don't really want because of the potential for human conflict with bears. And so if a bear wanders into the area, I'm not sure exactly if they might kill it or they tranquilize it and drag it away or something. They're trying to prevent, which is just interesting. I think that a state wildlife commission would try to prevent the recovery of an animal in its native range, but I think they have good reason for it. But they definitely show up from time to time, so it's definitely possible.
The other question I have related to these sightings, what is the thing that you saw on a camera trap and you went, really, those are here? What's sort of the big surprise?
Well, in the Raleigh area, there's 2 species that are surprisingly rare. And both of these species, you don't have to go too far to find them super abundant, especially in urban areas. And that is the striped skunk and the eastern chipmunk. And both species have an odd geographic range in that they're over most of the East Coast, and then they fall out as you go east of Raleigh. The skunk has the weirdest range. The striped skunk. Look at the striped skunk range, and there is a tiny little hole in eastern North Carolina where they don't occur. We don't know why. chipmunks have a larger hole that goes out throughout Georgia. And so in both cases, Raleigh is right on the edge of their range. And so it's interesting to see where we detect both. In chipmunks, we've gotten a fair amount in North Raleigh, but not elsewhere. And skunks, has anyone seen a skunk in Raleigh? Wake County? Smelled a skunk? Smelled it? Yeah, there's more often smelled it. But only one person smells a skunk, right? And in the town I used to live in, we would see them and smell them all the time. So we just got our first Raleigh skunk in a rural golf course this year. So specifically for Raleigh, those are surprising in how rare they are. And I think there might be an interesting story there about where a species lives at the edge of its range.
Once again, let's give Dr. Case.
Great.